Hello and thank you for looking at this video presentation. It was a talk which was first addressed to the members of the Moreira Teilhard U3A Art and History Group at La Scenietta Theatre in Moreira in 2017. This is an enormous and in some ways quite a technical subject, but I've made the presentation very simple and accompanied by lots of interesting pictures. Perhaps I should mention that as a northerner, I pronounce the word glass and not as the southern glass. And you can see here one of my favourite applications for this material. I've enjoyed more than 30 years working with a wide variety of glass products. First of all, I had 11 years with a general glass manufacturer in Barnsley called Wood Brothers Glass Company. They manufactured an enormously diverse range of products from car headlamps, spotlight lenses, reversing and indicator lamps, with our main customers being companies such as Lucas and Wipac. Of course, most of these products are now made in plastic. Wood Brothers also made different designs of cosmetic bottles and containers in a wide variety of colours for many of the well-known cosmetic brands. They also had a wide range of domestic glass, such as spaghetti jars, corn on the cob dishes, and avocado pear dishes. And whilst initially I was involved with all of those products, I was eventually appointed as the general manager of the laboratory glassware division. Sadly, Wood Brothers Glass Company went into receivership in 1980 after 170 years in business, basically due to the Wood family, which still owned it, not being prepared or perhaps not able to continually invest in new equipment. I then moved on to being involved with quite sophisticated laboratory equipment, and for 20 years I was designing and selling laboratory and pilot plant glass reaction and distillation systems similar to these to major petroleum, chemical and pharmaceutical companies. Now, before we talk about the history of man-made glass, we need to understand some of the ways in which glass is formed naturally. As you probably know, glass basically consists mainly of silica or sand. A nice, clean, white sand is by far the best for making glass, as red sands usually include a high ferrous or iron content, which is the cause of much of the green colouring of some of the poorer quality glasses. The simplest forms of natural glass only require some sand and a source of very high temperature. And of course, volcanoes achieve the temperatures required to produce molten lava rock, which usually includes some sand. Volcanic eruptions produce obsidian or crater glass, and this is the most common of the naturally formed glass types, and it's quite a well-known material in areas where there is some regular volcanic activity. Obsidian has been used since prehistoric times for making tools and weapons, when the very sharp shards of the natural glass were fashioned to make blades, arrowheads, and axes. However, obsidian can be found in a variety of colours, which were, and still are, used for making jewellery. Here are a few examples. Obsidian has even been used to make scalpels. And as you can clearly see here, obsidian blades are far sharper than any stainless steel scalpels, but of course they are much more expensive to manufacture. Then we have examples of natural glass which results when lightning strikes sand. And this is the type of glass which is formed. And this is another example. And then a much rarer form of natural glass is produced in the heat generated by meteorite impacts. This is a nice example. These are also typical examples of glass formed due to meteorite impact. So, naturally formed glasses were quite well known throughout man's history, and in many areas they were the source of useful tools, weapons, and ornaments. To make a fairly simple glass, the sort used for jam jars, wine bottles, and windows, you need a reasonable quality of silica or sand, and that forms the main body of almost any piece of glass. To reduce the high melting temperature of a glass, it's usual to add what is called cullet, which is basically broken glass which may be from previous melts of the same composition, or, for example, just old broken recycled bottles which are the same colour and type as the glass being produced. The reason for using cullet is that glass melts at far lower temperatures of around 800 degrees centigrade compared to the 2000 degrees centigrade needed to melt raw sand. So it helps with the melting process. There are now over 50,000 bottle banks in the United Kingdom and approximately 750,000 tons of glass is recycled every year. Also, to help with the melting process, soda ash is added. Soda ash is basically just wood ash from marine plants or burnt bracken or trees. But today it's produced in major industrial plants. By adding the ash and the cullet to the sand, the melting temperature of the sand can be reduced from approximately 2000 degrees centigrade to around 1400 degrees centigrade. Finally, and very important, limestone is added to stabilize the glass, otherwise it would have very poor resistance to weathering. Without the addition of limestone to stabilize the glass, it would fairly quickly begin to disintegrate and crumble, and soon would look like this. This is called water glass because over a long period of time it becomes soluble in water. So, now let's move on to the times when man first used or first learned how to make glass. The first evidence of man-made glass objects can be traced back to around 3500 BC, so approximately 5,500 years ago. They originated in Mesopotamia, which is now the areas known as Syria, Iraq, and Kuwait. Archaeological evidence suggests that the first true man-made glass probably originated in coastal North Syria. The earliest known glass objects were very simple beads which were probably initially created by accident in metalworking furnaces, and these eventually led to the manufacture of very simple glass containers. The history of metalworking can be traced back almost 9,000 years ago, and this was when man first learned to use furnaces to mix copper with tin to make bronze. It was bronze that enabled the ancient empires to produce some of the fearsome weapons for their conquering armies. It is believed that simple glass beads may have been formed in the furnace fires when some sands were melted in the metalworking process. Glassmaking developed and it became a prized luxury material. But then, and this is quite difficult to believe, various disasters overtook the wonderful civilizations in the Eastern Mediterranean in the Late Bronze Age, and the knowledge and skills of glassmaking were completely lost until being rediscovered in approximately 1750 BC or 3,700 years ago. So, there were approximately 1,800 years when the process of making glass was completely lost. The reason was simply because, as a result of constant fighting between the various kingdoms, the great cities and kingdoms in the Eastern Mediterranean in the Late Bronze Age were quite suddenly, over a period of only 50 years between 1200 and 1150 BC, almost entirely wiped out and replaced by mostly isolated and poor village cultures. All of those cities shown in red on this map were destroyed, and only those in blue survived this collapse. Examples of those destroyed included Mycenae, Troy, Hattusa, and Ugarit, which were all regional capital cities. This was the time of the Trojan Wars. Within a period of only 40 to 50 years, almost every significant city in the eastern Mediterranean world was destroyed. Many of them were never occupied again, and that is believed to be the cause of the loss of the knowledge of how to make glass for almost 1,800 years. Then, around 1750 BC, it's believed that Phoenician traders sailing by the north coast of Syria berthed their boats by the beaches at night and lit large fires using dried saltwort, which is a plant which thrives in salty marsh areas. The saltwort, when burned, created a form of soda ash, which acted as a flux, allowing the large beach fires to melt some sand at the relatively low temperatures of bonfires, creating very simple forms of glass. This is the type of boat those traders were using, and also shown is a beach fire similar to those they lit, which has formed some very basic glass. Very soon, in Egypt and Western Asia, there was a rapid growth in glass-making technology. Archaeological finds from this period include coloured glass ingots such as these, which were recovered from a sunken boat. As I mentioned earlier, glass melts at much lower temperatures than the sand which was used to make it. Therefore, it was much easier to melt these glass ingots than it was to produce new glass from sand, and so they became part of the commercial trade of that time, with the Phoenicians producing them and then selling them to Egyptians and Romans, and it was those ingots that they melted and formed into different shapes. Very simple vessels eventually appeared, which were often coloured and shaped. The earliest glass vessels or containers were generally made using what is called the core forming method. First of all, on the left, a clay shape was moulded over a metal rod. Then, a hot molten rope of glass was wound over the mould, followed by repeated reheating in the furnaces, and then the glass was rolled on a flat marvering table to flatten and join the sections together. Coloured strands of glass were used to finish the decoration, and the glass was reheated, and when it was still red hot, it was raked to form some lovely patterns. Finally, the clay mould was scraped away and washed out of the bottle. These were some of the results of the clay moulding process. The threads of thin glass of different colours were made using different mixtures of oxides, and they were wound round the moulds to create patterns, which could then be drawn into festoons by using metal raking tools when the glass was still semi-molten. Often these were really beautiful festoon patterns. This is a modern photograph, but the marvering process today is exactly the same as it was a couple of thousand years ago. The red-hot vessel will be rolled smooth or marvered on a slab in order to press the decorative threads into its body. The vessel was then allowed to cool gently over a period of time as the glass slowly annealed, and the clay core was finally scraped away from inside the vessel. I'll explain the term anneal a little later. As time progressed, the glassmakers developed many new skills. Much of the early glass decoration work was done using grinding techniques borrowed from the precious stoneworking skills of jewellery makers. This meant that the glass could be ground and carved, and as you can see, some were quite simple like those on the left. But by the time of Christ being on earth, wonderfully complicated designs such as this beautiful vase on the right were quite common. I will return to this particular vase later. Eventually, other new methods were being discovered. By the time of Alexander the Great, many new techniques of glass production were introduced and glass began to be used to make larger pieces, notably items of tableware. Techniques developed during this period included slumping, which is allowing viscous but not fully molten glass to form over a mould in order to make a dish. The bottle on the left illustrates that this is just a piece of glass which has been heated and allowed to collapse or slump, but the dish illustrates how beautiful some of the objects were that were made in this way. Surprisingly, the mille fiori, which means thousand flowers, technique, where canes of multicolored glass were sliced and the slices arranged together and fused in a mold to create a mosaic-like effect, was also introduced in this early period. These are mille fiori beads produced to make beautiful necklaces. You will all be familiar with modern mille fiori glass paperweights. However, surprisingly, this mille fiori technique was somehow almost entirely lost in the 16th century, and it wasn't rediscovered and reintroduced again until around 300 years later in the early 19th century. This was a lovely mille fiori vase manufactured around about 1820, soon after the technique was rediscovered. And these are some of the raw materials that were added to the glass mix to make different glass colours. So even in these early times, there were some very clever chemists experimenting with these materials. During the 1st century BC, the art of glassblowing was discovered on the Judean coast, roughly the area now known as Palestine, and this revolutionized the industry. Since then, almost nothing has changed in the way glassblowing has been done over the years. As time passed, more sophisticated furnaces appeared. In the Roman era, glass vessels were quite expensive compared to pottery vessels. However, a considerable growth in the use of glass products occurred throughout the Roman world. Eventually, glass became the Roman plastic, and glass containers produced in Alexander spread throughout the Roman Empire. With the discovery of clear glass, which basically was by using very pure deposits of white sand, but also through the introduction of manganese dioxide by glass blowers in Alexandria, the Romans began to use glass for architectural purposes. This is a piece of Roman glass window. Roman windows had poor optical qualities, but they did let in light and helped in cold weather, and they began to appear in the most important buildings in Rome and in the most luxurious villas in Pompeii. This is one of the techniques that was used to make windows. The glass was blown making a large balloon, then the bottom was cut open and the remaining glass was spun into a disc by hand and then cut to the required size. This is another beautiful example of Roman glass. You can see that they advanced to quite sophisticated mouth-blown designs and lovely, delicate colourings. It's interesting to see the beautiful shapes of the handles on some of the jugs. This is an example of glass blown in a mould, but not spun, as it has flat sides. Very skillful work, and this vase has also been cut and ground by a very clever engraver. Engraving wheels are traditionally made of copper with a linseed oil and fine emery powder mixture used as an abrasive. This is a nice iridescent mix of glass using quite sophisticated mixes of chemicals. And you can see from all of these examples that the art of glassmaking had progressed very rapidly in Roman times, and some of the art objects produced are quite amazing in their beauty and in the skills of the artisans who made them. These are wonderful examples of goblets which have been ground and polished to create the raised designs. Most of these grinding skills have been lost because it would take weeks or months just to make one goblet like these, and similar but far less beautiful goblets eventually could be made using moulds. Now let us move on from the history of glass to give you some information about the more modern varieties. Soda glass is the most common form of glass. Basically, it is just sand, potash, which is known as soda ash, and limestone with one or two chemical additions, and is generally used to produce glass containers for packaging, food, beverages, medicines, chemicals and cosmetics, and also for such products as windows. I'm sure you will agree that the picture illustrates one of its most important. So then we have lead glass. This was discovered by an Englishman called George Ravenscroft in 1674. When added to glass, lead makes glass brilliant, resonant and heavy. It makes it easier to cut and to grind and to polish. Glasses containing a large percentage of lead, more than 24%, are known as crystal or lead crystal. This is an interesting product which was one of many produced by Wood Brothers Glass Company in Barnsley, which I mentioned earlier. Obviously, it's a Chanel No. 5 perfume bottle, but it was made in standard soda glass, which is the simplest and cheapest glass, and it has been ground and then polished to make it look as though it was made using the much more expensive lead glass. The stopper alone has 17 facets, each of which was ground and then polished by hand, and then the stopper and the neck of the bottle were ground together to make a reasonable seal, just like some of the wine decanters you will have seen. After the bottle was filled with perfume, the manufacturers then securely sealed the bottle with wax. Today, they now use a soft plastic seal. I've always believed that the bottle and stopper probably cost far more to produce than the contents. Almost all glass products used in laboratories are in borosilicate glass because of its very high resistance to thermal shock and also to attack by acids and other chemicals. This is a laboratory glass reaction system which has jacketed vessels where the inner container is for the product, which may be being stirred, and the outer jacket allows hot or cold oils to be circulated to control the temperature of the contents. The temperatures can be controlled from around plus 300 degrees C to minus 100 degrees C. These experimental glass reaction systems are used mainly in pharmaceutical research. These are the same sort of systems, but much larger capacities. Almost all of that type of laboratory glassware is produced using borosilicate glass tubing on large lathes, which are very similar to woodworking or engineering lathes. Glass tubing is produced in diameters of less than a hair's width to almost half a meter. So, almost all laboratory or oven-proof glass products are manufactured using borosilicate. Quartz glass is basically pure silica from special sand deposits with virtually no other added ingredients. And it is an amazing material which has to be melted at around 2000 degrees centigrade. It has specialized laboratory and research applications and is used to make the most sophisticated reflective mirrors used in outer space telescopes because it doesn't change shape due to temperature variations caused perhaps by being in sunlight in space and then perhaps in Earth's shadow. It has many applications in science, but another more common application is the manufacture of the sheathed electric elements used in room heaters. Then we come to flat glass. Of course, you're all familiar with flat pane glass, which is used chiefly in buildings as windows. This is a window made with toughened glass, which provides a rather terrifying view below. This is an illustration of a swimming pool which will soon span 2 luxury apartment buildings in London, which are being built now next to the new United States Embassy in the Nine Elms area of Wandsworth. The pool is being constructed using 20-centimetre thick toughened glass, similar to that used in large aquariums. Optical glass is used in spectacles, microscopes, telescopes, camera lenses, and many instruments used in factories and laboratories. The raw materials must be pure so that the glass can be made almost flawless. The care required for producing optical glass makes it quite expensive compared with other kinds of glass. Fiberglass consists of very fine but solid rods of glass. These tiny glass fibers can be loosely packed together in a wool-like mass that can serve as heat insulation in your loft. They also can be used like wool or cotton fiber to make glass yarn, tape, cloth, and mats. Fiberglass has many other uses. It's used for electrical insulation, chemical filtration, and firefighters' suits. Combined with plastics, fiberglass can be used for airplane wings and bodies, automobile bodies, and boat hulls. Laminated safety glass is a sandwich made by combining alternate layers of flat glass and clear plastic sheet. The outside layer of glass may break when struck by an object, but the plastic layer is elastic and so it stretches. The plastic holds the broken pieces of glass together and keeps them from flying in all directions. This method was used for car windscreens until toughened safety glass was introduced, but it's now mostly used in bulletproof windows, for examples in banks or in presidents' cars. This is toughened glass. Toughened glass is basically sheet glass which has been cut to shape, for example for windows in cars or shower screens, doors in shops and stores, etc. It is heated and then rapidly cooled using jets of cold air so that the exterior of the glass contracts rapidly whilst the interior is still hot, and this makes the interior under high tension. This process makes toughened glass very resistant to shock, but more importantly ensures that if it is broken, it shatters into many small, relatively harmless, dull-edged pieces. Actually, if you're wearing polarized sunglasses, you can often see the pattern of the air jets on the windscreen of your car, and to some extent, the stress in the glass. Glass building bricks are made from 2 hollow half sections sealed together at high temperature. They are good insulators against heat or cold because of the dead airspace inside. They're laid like normal building bricks to make walls and other structures. Glass fiber optics are used to transmit information as pulses of light. Thin, extremely pure optical fibers are used to carry telephone and television signals and digital data over long distances. They are increasingly used in cars and aircraft to almost instantly transmit signals such as airbag deployment, and most of the internal lighting in cars is now used using fiber optics. Glass ceramics are strong materials made by heating glass in a particular way to rearrange some of its atoms into regular patterns. These partially crystalline materials can withstand very high temperatures, sudden changes in temperature, and chemical attacks better than ordinary glass can. They're used in a variety of products such as laboratory hot plates, domestic hot plates, turbine engines, and the nose cones of guided missiles. This is a very newly developed glass that can easily be bent. It is already being used to make solar energy interlinked roof tiles, which I'm sure you will agree are far more attractive than the solar panels now generally in use. There are, of course, many more highly specialized glasses, but we only have a limited time. I want to mention again part of the glass manufacturing process, which is called annealing. I expect most of you, when you were younger, have experienced a piece of glass cracking or even exploding for no apparent reason, although it is a relatively rare occurrence nowadays. Immediately after glasses are formed, they are usually annealed or slowly and evenly cooled in order to reduce internal stresses, and this can be done by placing items in a furnace and simply allowing it to cool slowly. For larger quantities, the stress is removed using a leer, where items are continually loaded at one very hot end on a continuous metal belt, which slowly moves them to progressively cool. This is a very interesting example of the stressing glass, which is called a Prince Rupert's drop, or sometimes they're referred to as Dutch tears. They're formed when the glass worker has molten glass on his iron rod and allows it to drop like treacle into a bucket of cold water, and then he quickly seizes the fine end and takes it from the water. The water has very rapidly cooled the exterior of the drop, leaving the interior still extremely hot, and the compression due to the contraction of the cool external layer on the still red-hot inner causes enormous stresses. The colours in the drops in this picture illustrate the extremely high stress. The amazing result is that after being allowed to cool, the solid glass bulb can be hit hard with a normal hammer or even with a bullet without. The fine tail of the bead, which can be quite long, is also extremely strong and often requires the use of a pair of pliers to break it. But when it's broken, the forces released simply explode the complete drop into a very fine powder. These drops were discovered in northern Germany as early as 1625 and spread across Europe as a form of entertainment. Although they're called after him, Prince Rupert didn't discover them, but he brought examples to England in 1660. He gave some to King Charles II, who then gave some to the Royal Society for Scientific Study. If those drops had been annealed, they would just have been normal glass beads with a very fragile tail. But in their original high-stressed state, they were a great form of amusement. Now some examples of some interesting glass buildings. This is the National Grand Theatre of China in Beijing. This is the Botanical Garden at Curitiba in Brazil. This, the Basque Health Department in Bilbao. And this is the Sage Performing Arts Building in Gateshead. So, let us now quickly mention the properties of glass. It is hard and its surface is quite resistant to scratches and abrasions. It is elastic. It will bend under stress up to a breaking point, but it always rebounds exactly to its original shape. It is highly resistant to chemical corrosion and resistant to thermal shock. It can withstand intense heat or cold, as well as sudden temperature changes. It absorbs heat and retains heat rather than conduct it. It absorbs heat better than metal. It has excellent optical properties and reflects, bends, transmits, and absorbs light with great accuracy. It is highly electrical insulating and strongly resists electrical current, and it is still used in many countries to connect a power line to the supporting pylons. To close, earlier I showed you a picture of this vase. It is known as the porcelain vase, and it is a Roman cameo glass vase which is dated to between AD 1 and AD 25, although some believe it may be slightly earlier and made perhaps just before the birth of Christ. It is probably the best known piece of Roman cameo glass in the world, and it has served as an inspiration over the years to many glass and porcelain makers. It is believed that it was discovered sometime around 1582 at Monte del Grano near Rome, in what was thought to be the sarcophagus of the Emperor Alexander Severus, who died in AD 235. It was first recorded in Rome in 1600, so around the reign of Elizabeth I, and since 1810 It's been in the British Museum in London. The vase is made of violet blue glass, and it's surrounded with a single continuous white glass cameo making two distinct scenes, depicting 7 human figures, plus a large snake, and 2 bearded and horned heads below the handles, marking the break between the 2 scenes. In approximately 1778, Sir William Hamilton, the British ambassador in Naples, purchased it from Cornelia Barberini Colonna, who was the Princess of Palestrina. She had inherited the vase from the Barberini family, and for some years it was known as the Barberini vase. Hamilton brought it to England, and eventually it passed into the possession of the 3rd Duke of Portland. He eventually lent the vase to Josiah Wedgwood. Wedgwood then devoted 4 years trying to duplicate this vase, not in glass, but in blue and white jasperware. He had many problems with his copies, and he feared that he could never apply the jasper relief thinly enough to match the vase's original subtlety and delicacy. However, he finally managed to perfect it in 1790 with the issue of his first edition copies, and this marked Josiah Wedgwood's last major achievement. Wedgwood put the first edition on private show between April and May 1790, and that exhibition was so popular that visitor numbers had to be restricted by only printing 1,900 entry tickets. On the 7th of February 1845, the original vase was shattered by someone called William Lloyd, who, after drinking all the previous week, threw a nearby sculpture on top of the case containing the vase, smashing both the case and the vase. He was arrested and charged with the crime of wilful damage, and was ordered to pay a fine of £3 or spend 2 months in prison. He remained in prison until an anonymous benefactor paid the fine. The vase was pieced together with a fair success, although the restorer was unable to replace all of the pieces, and 37 small fragments were left when he was done. By 1848, the restoration appeared aged, and it was decided to restore the vase again. But the restorer was only successful in replacing 3 of the 37 fragments. Unfortunately, the adhesive from this restoration weakened, and so lasted for only 39 years, and by 1986 the joints rattled when the vase was gently tapped. The last reconstruction took place in 1988. The treatment had scholarly attention and press coverage. The BBC filmed the conservation process. Little sign of the original damage is visible, and except for light cleaning, the vase should not require major conservation work for many years. It is believed that the Portland vase must have taken its original artisan no less than 2 years to produce. The cutting was probably formed by a skilled gem cutter, possibly a chap called Dioscorides, as some beautifully engraved gems of a similar period are known and were signed by him. And so there you have it, a very much condensed history of glass with some information as to how it started as an accidental discovery, how it emerged through the ages as a useful domestic and decorative product, and how it has now become a highly sophisticated and technological material. Thank you for looking at this video, and I hope you found it to be interesting and enjoyable.